Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial where I will be demonstrating how you can send back an asynchronous HTTP response to an HTTP request that you have received in your flow. So before we begin, in case you want to learn more about how an HTTP request itself works, you can check out my fellow MVP Matt Collins Jones YouTube video on the same. I will link it down in the description, so please be sure to check it out. And let's start with this example. So I will create a short flow, and the first thing I will do is search for my trigger. So the trigger here would be a request, and as you can see, the name of the connector itself is request, and the HTTP request itself is the trigger. Now as you can see, the URL is not readily available. You need to save the flow first, but in order to save the flow you need to add some steps. So let me mimic a lengthy flow by just adding a delay of let's say 3 minutes to it, so that it is understood that this flow will be running for quite some time before it can send back a response. And I'm again searching for a response, and in the request connector itself the action is called as response. Now if I select that, this is the last step in my flow. I am sending back a 200 status, and maybe just I'll put some headers. Not necessarily you can or you should send headers, but I'll just do it anyway. Now this is the body that I'm sending back in JSON, and I'm just trying to send a message saying that thank you for submitting your request, right? So this is the message the caller application will receive if the flow happens to run all correctly. Let me save my flow. I'll give it a name async request, and I'll just save it. Now this is being saved, and if I open the request, once the save is complete, a URL will be generated. Now the URL is there, and I can simply copy it, and in order to test this flow I will go to Postman and simply paste the URL into the URL bar. And now what happens is all the parameters and everything is auto populated, but in order to send some data I will create a raw JSON data as an example, and maybe I'll send some color, and let me call it as blue, and I'll add another code to it, and maybe just put some alphanumerical example, and my short data here is generated. I will just copy all this and go back to my flow so that we can generate the schema to accept, right? So coming back to my flow, you can see that the request body JSON schema field is blank, but to generate the schema I will use the payload button, and I will paste the data that I copied, and I'll click done. So as you can see, the schema has been generated, and since I am posting, so I will use a post message and save the flow. Now that the flow is being saved, it is kind of ready to be used already. So that's my flow, and I will go back again to the Postman in order to test this out. So here I am, and now I will try to send the request using the send button, and we will observe how by default the behavior is synchronous, how the Postman will behave. Now by default, since the request is synchronous, or I would say the response itself is synchronous, it is waiting for a long time. This is not an ideal condition how you should be designing the flow, and if the flow is expected to run a little longer, it's a best practice to let the calling application know that the request has been accepted. As you can see in the flow that the delay is mimicking a lengthy run of the flow, and the calling application is waiting for a response here, right? So now let me just fast forward this scenario, assuming that our 3 minutes which we added in the flow are completed, and towards the end of the request the calling Postman application will receive a timeout like this, right? So in order to avoid that, what we will do is we will make the response as asynchronous, so that we immediately get a message that the request has been accepted. So coming back to my flow, let's look at the response itself. And now what we will do is we'll go into settings, and you can see an option there that you can turn on the asynchronous response, and it will send back a 202 accepted message back to the calling application. So I will just turn it on and I'll click done, and I'll just save this flow. So what I've done is I've made the response as asynchronous, so whenever this flow is called, a quick asynchronous response will be sent back to the calling application. So coming back to the Postman again, this time we will send another request to see how the asynchronous response will be received. Here is my flow. We will have to check some headers post we send. So let me send it out. So now I've clicked on send, and as you can see that instantaneously you have received a 202 accepted response. And let us scroll to the top of the headers and try to locate a location header. So a location header will be sent back, which will have a URL. So what you can do is you can simply copy this URL, and let's try to call this URL and see what it gives us. It will give us the status of the request itself, or the status of the flow, and as you can see that it has returned that the flow is still running. Remember, our flow was supposed to run for 3 minutes. Now, looking at the flow, you can see that it's running, and assume that it has now completed the 3 minutes. And if you come back to the Postman and just try to make that call again to the status of the flow from the location header, you will actually receive whatever message you were supposed to receive when the HTTP flow response would have been completed. So that's how you can make a flow send HTTP response in asynchronous way. And that was about it. I hope this really helped you. Please do subscribe, and I will promise to come back with more great content. Appreciate your time. Thank you.